In this lesson, we will look at evolution. So by the end of the lesson, students should be able to outline evolution by natural selection and how it explains the diversity of living things. So in other words, why there are so many different types of living things on the earth. So this is Charles Darwin, and in 1859 he explored the Galapagos Islands. So he sent off on a voyage and he spent a lot of time on the Galapagos Islands. And basically when he went there, he carried out like an ecological study, and he studied the wildlife that was on the island. And he examined the differences in many animals, such as finches, and this is one where he kind of became famous. So he noticed that on different islands around the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that finches had different types of beaks depending on the type of food that was on the island. And after he went about and he carried out his studies and he done his explorations, he wrote down all his thoughts and he put it in a book called On the Origin of Species, which suggests that organisms have a common ancestor. So what he believed was that all of life, if you like, originated from one common form, and then over a period of time, that form started to change and diversify. So for example, like there would have been one species of finch, and then over time, that one species of finch changed. Some of the population became finches that had this type of beak, others became finches that had this type of beak, and this type of beak, and this type of beak. And what he found was that this was tightly linked in with the environment that those finches were in and were living in. And he found that the type of beak that the finch had was linked in with the food source, for example, that was on the different parts or the different islands that these individual finches came from. So it was really the start of this idea of evolution, and Charles Darwin is the guy that kind of got credited with the putting into words that idea that he observed. So variation and breeding. So what Darwin noticed was that organisms produce a large number of offspring, and each pair of breeding finches could produce 20 to 30 young birds. So each pair of finches, for example, can produce a whole, like up to 20 to 30 younger birds or offspring. Darwin also noticed differences between all of the offspring, and we call these differences variations, and they are caused by random changes in the DNA called mutations. So what happens is, if you take, for example, if this is the male finch and then this is the female finch here, when they breed with each other, if you like, half of the genetic information from the male finch and half of the genetic information from the female finch will be given to the offspring, for example. So if we have an offspring like this, it's going to have half of the genetic information from the male and half of the genetic information from the female. So what that will mean is that if these are the parents, for example, then the offspring will be different, will be slightly different. So they will have like some kind of variation or like slightly like some kind of a change, for example, to their physical structure. They won't be exactly the same as the parents, they'll be slightly different. And what kind of plays, what happens then, if you like, so if you like the genes that the offspring gets from its parents, it gives the organism or it gives the offspring traits. And those traits then will either give the organism an advantage. It'll be either an advantage to the offspring or it'll be some kind of a disadvantage. And an advantage in helping the offspring to survive. So helping the offspring to attract a mate or helping the offspring to be able to get food or find shelter. So it's these kind of if you like, these variations. Okay, so every offspring will be slightly different to the parents and will have slightly different traits than the parents. And those traits then, sometimes they can be an advantage and they help the organism. And so you have, if you like, you have the organism, and then that organism, if you like, is operating inside an environment. So you have these new traits that the offspring are inheriting, if you like, from the parents, and it's just through random variation. And then those traits, depending on the environment that they're in, can be of either an advantage and help the offspring to survive, and then as a result to be able to reproduce and pass on their genes, or it will be a hindrance and it'll cause the organism to die off. And then we have this thing like competition and survival of the fittest. So if we take, for example, in this environment, resources are going to be limited. So if we think about resources, so what kind of resources? Food, shelter, a mate, water. Okay, and these are some of the resources that are going to be limited, if you like, in the environment. So what will happen is the offspring that have traits that allow them to, the traits might help them to get food easy. They might help them to like build better shelters. It might help them to find a better mate, or it might help them to consume water. So these slight changes or slight variations will, if they give the organism or the offspring an advantage, that offspring is more likely to survive. And if it is more likely to survive, the offspring will then go on to reproduce, and its genes will be passed on to the next generation along with its traits. And then also there might be some other new variations that could be added to the organism. So as an example, if I am a finch, for example, and I live on, let's say this is the island that I live on here, and the only food source on this island is like, let's say, some kind of like a walnut. Okay, so it's like a hard nut. So unless I have the right beak, so in order to break this nut, I need to have the gene that gives me like this big strong beak. And this big strong beak then will enable me to be able to break through the shell and therefore to get the food. Now, if I have the gene that gives me like a short thin beak like this that's used to consume insects, I can't get food, or I can't get nutrients from this particular nut. That's the main food source on this island. And as a result of that, what's going to happen is the finch that has this beak and has the genes for this beak or has this trait, it's going to have an advantage over this finch because it's going to be able to get food or have access to its food source much easier. And as a result, this finch will get big and strong, and it will be more likely to survive, and as a result it'll be more likely to breed, and as a result this trait of having this type of beak, for example, will be passed on to the offspring, and then they will be able to thrive and survive on this island. Now, let's say over time something happens in the environment, like the temperature changes, and all of a sudden this food source is destroyed, and then all of a sudden the main food source on the island is insects. Okay, particular types of insects, and they live inside these tiny little like burrows like this inside the wood. All of a sudden then this beak here, this big thick beak, becomes a disadvantage because you can't get access to the insects, whereas this beak here, this long thin beak, it wasn't able to crack open the nut, but it's able to get into this little hole and get this insect out, and as a result this organism, this finch with this type of beak, is going to live, is going to survive, and this one will start to die off, the numbers will drop. And as a result of it, now all of a sudden the environment favors this particular finch. So it's going to outcompete this type of finch, and then it's going to thrive on the island. So this is where you have these two elements that are at play. So you have the environment, okay, that's at play. So it produces, let's say, a particular type of food source or whatever and then what's going to happen then is, depending on the traits that the finches have, for example, they will either adapt, it'll either enable them to adapt to the environment and get their food source, or it'll be a hindrance and it'll stop them from getting their food source. And as a result of that, the populations will either increase or decrease depending on whether they are adapted and they are able to outcompete their rivals on the island for resources. So there may not be enough food or space for a large number of offspring. Competition is the struggle between organisms for limited resources. The organisms that can get enough food will be more likely to live longer and to reproduce, and the fittest organism is the organism most likely to survive to reproduce. So that's what we mean by competition and survival of the fittest. And these adaptations that organisms get, they just come from random mutations in DNA. So imagine this is our strand of DNA. And what might happen is there might be just a random mutation, let's say, in this part of the DNA. And then what that will do is that will introduce, for example, a new trait to an organism. So when the parents reproduce, for example, the offspring will have a random change in their DNA. So their DNA will be it'll be a mixture of both parents' DNA. And as a result of that, what can happen is you can get these random mutations in the offspring's DNA. And what that will do is it can give them like some traits, and those traits might help them to survive. So random mutations in DNA have produced organisms with features that allow them to survive better than others. So like this example that we talked about here. And adaptation is a structure that helps an organism to survive in its ecosystem. So if we take this island, this is the island, its ecosystem, the bird's ecosystem, and the beak type, for example, would be an adaptation. Depending on the main food source, would either be an advantage or a disadvantage to the organism. Long beaks can better feed on insects, and bright colors can attract mates. So again, there'll be these two types of variation. So if we have a look here, so we can see the different types of beaks that these birds have, and these beaks basically will either be an advantage or a disadvantage to them depending on the ecosystem that they are part of. So if, for example, the main food source is like nuts, for example, then this finch here that has this particular really strong beak will have the strength to be able to crack it, whereas this guy won't. Okay, if let's say so all of these birds here are finches. The difference between them is the adaptation that they have. They all have different types of beaks. So if we take this guy here, so this guy would feed on insects and nectar from flowers, for example, and that's his beak is perfectly designed to do that. Whereas this guy here, if he's a finch, but if he tried to do that, he doesn't have the long fine beak that this guy here has. So this fella is designed to he uses heavy beak to crush seeds, so his main food source is going to be seeds. This guy here, his beak favors, he tears back bark in search for beetles, so he eats beetles behind bark. This guy here feeds on nectars from flowers, so again he wouldn't be able to survive on the food source that this guy survives on because he doesn't have the equipment or the beak to be able to eat it. This guy here, he forages for insects, often under bark, so again these two are fairly similar. And this guy here again, he would feed on nectar, and you can see that he has this long beak that would allow him to do that. So therefore his main food source would be nectar. So again, these are all adaptations, so they are, and all of these finches would have come from one finch, and over time, depending on the environment that they evolved in, they would through random mutations in their DNA, they would be given these different traits. And those traits would either help them to survive in their ecosystem or not help them to survive in the ecosystem. So here again would be another example. So for example, if we have giraffes, again, through random mutations in DNA and parents passing on their genes to offspring, for example, neck height or neck length would be, for example, would be a trait that they would inherit from their parents. And again, depending on the food source, if their food source is on really high branches, it's going to be much easier for the offspring that have the random mutation that gives them a longer neck to get access to this food. And as a result of that, they are going to survive and they will reproduce and pass on this trait. Whereas these guys here that don't have that trait are going to struggle to survive in this environment because they can't get access to their food source and they will start to die out. So mutations that are useful in an ecosystem will allow that organism to survive. Mutations that give a disadvantage will lead to that organism dying or not reproducing. And natural selection is the way those organisms that are best suited are the ones that survive to reproduce. Okay, so that is how natural selection works. So it's a mix between the DNA, the mutations, the traits that the offspring inherit, and then also the environment as well. And whether the trait that they inherit, it gives them an advantage or a disadvantage for surviving and competing for limited resources in their particular ecosystem. So evolution then is the genetic change in a species over a long period of time, like what we've seen with the finches. Evolution eventually leads to organisms being so different that they form new species. And different species cannot breed successfully with each other. So what makes one species different than another species is that they can't breed with each other. So if we take, for example, like domestic dogs, they have all evolved from wilder ancestors from wolves, for example. And over like periods of time, depending on the environment that the particular organism was breeding and reproducing in, they would have acquired different traits. And they in fact, over a long period of time, they can be completely different to their ancestor. And as a result of that, they become new species. And as a result of that, they are not able to breed, for example, with their older species. So what evolution tells us then basically is that over time, organisms, they change and they adapt to their environment. So what is some of the evidence for evolution? So we know that 60 million years ago, horses were similar or smaller and had wide feet because of fossils. Fossils are the imprints or remains in stone of organisms that lived millions of years ago. So archaeologists have dug up fossils, for example, of organisms over that are millions of years old. So if we take examples of horses, for example, by digging up and looking at fossils, so we have fossils that were like 50 million years old. And again, they are horses because they have the traits, for example, of horses. And we can see, like over time, we can see, for example, if we look at this example, 50 million years ago, this is what horses looked like, and this is what there's fossil records show. And 35 million years ago, this is what they looked like. 26 million years ago, they look like this. And then 3 million years ago, this is kind of like what they look like. So very different to what organisms look like nowadays. Very different to what horses look like now in modern times. So again, fossil records show they feel like they give, over different periods of time, you could see these different fossils that show the changes, for example, that have occurred in species of horse, for example, over millions of years, and we can see these changes over time. And also as well, what we see if we look at, for example, if we look at the skeletal structure of organisms now, we can see that, so if we look at, so for example, these are humans, cat, whale and bat, we can see the same types of features, for example, in each of the different organisms' makeup or bone structure. And what this points towards is that we have all come from a common source or a common ancestor, and over time we have evolved. Other evidence to show that then as well is also in embryos. So for example, if you look at embryos at the very early stages before they start to specialize and differentiate, we can see here, so these are embryos of all different organisms. We can see the names of the organisms down here. And we can see, for example, so these are humans, and this is a rabbit, this is a calf, this is a hog, this is a chick, a tortoise, a salamander, and a fish. So we can see that the early embryos, they look pretty much identical. And it's only after the embryos develop over a period of time that the unique characteristics that distinguish one species from the other start to become more noticeable. But again, this all points towards that we have all kind of evolved, if you like, from a common ancestor. And over time, we have evolved and changed and adapted to our particular environment. And we've changed so much that these species can't breed with each other anymore, and therefore they are what are known as separate species. So this basically points towards this what's known as the tree of life. So that basically all of life started from a source, and then over millions of years of evolution and adaptation, what we have this huge diversity of living things that we see all around us today. And that's a direct result of millions of years of like reproduction and slight changes and variations, and those changes allowing the organism to either adapt to its environment or to die off in its environment. And then over periods of time, those adaptations and those slight changes change the organism so much over generation and generation and generation that they turn into completely different species. And as a result, what we have on the earth then, we have a huge variety of living things. There's a huge biodiversity of living organisms on the planet. So that is evolution. So again, we've outlined evolution by natural selection and how it explains for the diversity of living things on the planet. Okay, thank you for listening.